Hey everyone, I'm Ben, the amateur exegete, and this is episode 53 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is, To Whom It Is Concerned. Last time, we looked at the letter's senders, prisoner Paul and brother Timothy. Today, we will consider the addressees, mentioned at the end of verse 1 and in verse 2. To Philemon, our dear friend and co-worker, to Apphia, our sister, to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. Let's begin with Philemon. If you search the rest of the New Testament, you won't find Philemon anywhere. He doesn't even show up in the Acts of the Apostles. So who was he, and what can we say about him? In his introduction to the New Testament, Bart Ehrman lays out a few things that seem likely about Philemon. First, he was relatively wealthy. Why think this? For one thing, the assembly that meets does so in Philemon's house. Meeting in private homes was not uncommon during this period. After all, there were no church buildings at the time. But with regards to Philemon, it tells us that he has enough space to accommodate a gathering of people. Barbara Geller, in her notes for the Jewish Annotated New Testament, writes, the membership would likely have been at most 30 to 40 people, given the size of a large, but not patrician home in Roman cities. Another reason to think that Philemon was relatively wealthy is that he owned at least one slave, Onesimus, who we meet in verse 10. Finally, in verse 18, Paul may be implying that Onesimus wronged Philemon by stealing something of value. For Ehrman, these three things point to Philemon being a relatively well-off individual. In addition to his socioeconomic status, there's another thing that Ehrman believes we can say about Philemon. He was probably one of Paul's converts. In verse 19, Paul suggests that Philemon is indebted to him in some way. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it. I say nothing about your owing me, even your own self. What sort of debt could this have been? Financial? That seems unlikely, given how often Paul seems to be living paycheck to paycheck, as it were. Instead, the debt is probably spiritual, specifically that it was through Paul's preaching that Philemon came to be a Christ follower. Apart from these things, Ehrman writes, we cannot say much about the man himself. What about the next name on the list of addressees, Apphia? Like Philemon, this is the only place she appears in the New Testament. So, who is she? She's obviously a Christ follower. The fact that the letter is, in addition to Philemon, addressed to her, and she's labeled a sister, establishes that. But what is her relationship to Philemon, or to Archippus for that matter? Mitzi Smith, writing in the Women's Bible Commentary, thinks that her placement after Philemon indicates her importance in the community, perhaps someone who is, in Smith's language, second in command. Another possibility is that she is Philemon's wife, but these two options need not be mutually exclusive. If Philemon and Apphia represent husband and wife leaders of the assembly, then they aren't alone. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19, Paul writes to the Christ followers at Corinth, the churches of Asia send greetings. Aquila and Prisca, together with the church in their house, greet you warmly in the Lord. These two were likely a husband and wife who served as leaders in an assembly in their home. Interestingly, when Paul names the pair in Romans chapter 16, verse 3, Prisca is named first. If Apphia is the wife of Philemon and a leader in the assembly, then perhaps Archippus is their son, a suggestion made by Ronald Huck in his notes in the HarperCollins Study Bible. Archippus is mentioned in only one other place in the New Testament, the Epistle to the Colossians. There, in chapter 4, verse 17, Paul requests that the recipients tell Archippus, "See that you complete the task that you have received in the Lord." Is this the same Archippus? Maybe. Lending weight to the notion that it is that in verse 9 of Colossians chapter 4, we read the name Onesimus, the same name of the slave that belonged to Philemon. In fact, if you survey Philemon chapter 1 verses 23 and 24 and compare it to what we find in Colossians chapter 4 verses 10 through 14, you will find significant overlap in names. But there's a problem. It's likely that Paul didn't write the letter to the Colossians. Now's not the time to get into the issue here, but Jennifer Berenson notes in her introduction to Colossians for the New Oxford Annotated Bible that though the letter resembles the undisputed letters of Paul in some ways, it nevertheless lacks some central Pauline terms, uses new theological vocabulary, and is composed in a more elevated liturgical style. There's no way to verify that Archippus was the son of Philemon and Apphia. What is explicitly said of him is that he is our fellow soldier. Craig Wansink, in the Oxford Bible Commentary, remarks that the military imagery may refer to a character attribute, like loyalty. If that's the case, Archippus is known perhaps for his fidelity to the assembly and to Paul. In verse 3, we find a fairly standard greeting. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. This ends the prescript found in verses 1 through 3 of the letter. We are now ready to move on to the body of the letter and consider Paul's message to Philemon. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time. And remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for stopping by.